thank you for the invitation. I am very happy to be here. I love this stuff. I study this stuff. And I always enjoy talking about it to people who are interested. This past cycle was very interesting. I don't think there are any surprises in it other than the speed at which the governor was elected. And we're going to talk about that today. I want to give you a little bit of background about, if you can do a statewide candidacy or major initiative, some things that are good to know and keep in mind. Louisiana has about 3 million voters, a little bit shy of 3 million. We have 64 parishes. The top 8 parishes represent 52% of the registered voters. When you go to the top 16 parishes, you're at 72% of all registered voters. So 1/4 of our parishes represent almost 3/4 of the voters. And so parishes 17 to 32 only represent 16%, 33 to 48, 8%, and 48 to 64, only 6%. So this map up here kind of washed out, and I apologize for that, but the darker greens are the bigger parishes and they're ranked. So when I work with candidates on a statewide basis, it's absolutely imperative that you visit every parish. But don't get out the car if they're not in the top 16. Honk your horn and wave. Spend all of your time, as much time as you can, in the big 8 and then the secondary, because it's a numbers game. So speaking of numbers game, it's all about who votes, okay? We can talk about all sorts of philosophical differences. We can talk about interest and whatever. But unless you vote, it doesn't matter. And so one of the things about the Secretary of State's voter registration system is that there's a wealth of great information associated with every voter. We know residential address. We know their gender. We know their political party. We know their vote history. The Secretary of State maintains a field in the voter registration record that is 160 characters long. So every time you vote, 11, 18, 2023, those 8 digits get put in that field. Then the next time you vote, that date gets put in first, and so on and so forth. So while I was at GCR, and I sold my interest in GCR a number of years ago, but we wrote the voter registration system for the state of Louisiana. We also wrote the ballot building system and the website that does all the results. So there's a fundamental understanding of how the voter registration system works. Louisiana's practice of a statewide voter registration system was really recognized very early on. This goes back to prior to 2000. I think Jerry Fowler was the Commissioner of Elections at that time. And so Louisiana's always been at the forefront of this. So when we plan an election, one of the things that I do is look at the voters who are going to participate in that election. And respectfully, I'm deadly accurate at it because it's a matter of public record. If you recognize the obvious, everybody will think you're a genius. It's in the record. So we know what type of elections that people vote in. A presidential election, you have a 70% turnout. A governor's election typically is about a 45% turnout. Municipal elections get down to a 35% turnout. And special elections, tax initiatives and stuff like that, sometimes 15%. So one of the things that we do is that we look at your vote history. We look at all the elections that have been held in the precincts that you're living in that you could have voted in, and score the ones that you voted in and did not vote in. And so for any given election, I pull up the history and say, okay, who's likely to participate in this election? We identify what we call targets, and those are the people that are the primary focus of the campaign. The campaign has 2 incredible resources that they have to manage well: money and time. You don't need to waste your time with people who don't vote. It's not that you ignore them. People will see the signs, people will hear your radio spots, they'll see any print ads. If you're on TV, they'll see that. But where you spend your time knocking doors, making phone calls, sending volunteers, sending mail, it's this selected set. And it works pretty well. So while we anticipated what was going to happen this fall, we didn't really think Jeff Landry would win, Governor-elect Landry would win in the primary. Respectfully, I think I probably surveyed this race more than anybody because I represented a number of interests who were looking at it. And we were surveying it monthly beginning in April and then tracking it regularly after qualifying in August. So I had a great history of where the candidates were and the like. It was clear. It was clear from day one Landry was going to win. And as we got into the process, you could really see it even more clearly because the other candidates were not moving. And one of the things that's fascinating to me about this race is that throughout the period of tracking and forecasting what's going to happen, your second tier, Wagasback, Schroeder, Hewitt, they never grew beyond 6%. Never. Hewitt never grew beyond 3% in any of the tracking. So surely, though, you think you've got some undecided voter, some of it's going to break that way. It didn't, you know. So Landry ran a brilliant race, and he proved beyond a shadow of a doubt who votes matters because we had an incredibly low turnout. But it wasn't just the low turnout. It was that there was not a lot of interest in some people with this. So let me show you this. I think this is pretty interesting. Then we're going to go through some things pretty quickly. This is early voting by day, and I'm sorry, I know you cannot see this, but one of the things that I do is look at people in terms of groups. So if your group, Republicans or Democrats or independents or male, female, or race, white, African American, or other, if you represent 25% of the registered voters, you should be casting 25% of the vote. And if you don't, you'll see that you're not on equal par. If you cast more than 25% of the vote, you've got an advantage. Early voting is indicative of what's going to happen on election day. No question about it. We do a statewide survey with 600 samples, and we talk about margin of error of 3 or 4% and things like that. Early voting, 300,000 people, no undecided. And we look at, okay, who's voting? Where's the interest in this? One of the things that was fascinating in this is, well, let me step back for a second. I've been involved with statewide races in Louisiana since Mary Landry in 2002. That was the first really big one that I did. And then I did Blancos and I did Senator Vitters, and I've been involved ever since. But we talk about white African American and other races, and we talk about Republican, Democrats, and other parties. In Louisiana, there's a very definitive voting pattern. Republicans vote in an absolutely predictable way, African Americans in a predictable way, and then you have the other group, white, other race, Democrats, other parties. So if you're not an African American and you're not a Republican, you're a WODO, okay? That's the swing vote. That's what put Edwards in. It's a centrist vote, tends to vote more Republican, okay? No question about it. And we're going to look at some real hard facts of that. But as much as I do this, and as much as I say, recognize the obvious and everybody think you're a genius, I thought what I was seeing in early voting was an anomaly. Because theoretically, when you get to a governor's race, and in tracking it, while Landry had really hardcore supporters, he also had pretty high negatives, on this. But what we saw in early voting is that on my voter effectiveness, where if everybody's voting on par, everybody's equal to 1, Republicans are turning out at 1.3, the Republican vote, the African American at 0.8, and the independents, who represent 27% of the voters, are turning out at 0.5. So when you start looking at the results of the poll and the tracking, which you're looking at what's a typical turnout, and you're building your sample accordingly, and you say, okay, Landry's going to finish in the mid-40s, okay? Wilson's going to be right around 40 or something like that. But the problem was, it didn't turn out that way. So when we look at what actually happened after the election, we see, once again, I apologize, I know you can't see these numbers, but it's all the green means good and red means underperforming on this. But the voters that we typically target, which we call Tier 1 and Tier 2, they cast 80% of the votes. They represent less than 40%, about 40% of the voters, but they cast 80% of the votes. So knowing who to talk to is key, and that's what that's about. So, I'm sorry, let me go back to our presentation and show you a few things about this. So, this is what the race looked like. And I'm sorry, it's kind of dark, but the red parishes are the parishes that Landry carried. The blue parishes are ones that Wilson carried. So essentially, 60 parishes voted for Landry, 4 parishes voted for Wilson. So when we look at this, how did this happen so quickly? Because no one was, I shouldn't say no one, I'm not aware of anyone who was really expecting an outright victory on this. What you see here is a post-election statistics report. It says who actually voted. And the red box looks at 2019, the blue box, and the box on the bottom, red box, is 2023. And what we see is that there was a phenomenal disparity in turnout in the solid Republican vote, which are Republicans, and the solid African-American vote, which are Democrats. A 20-point spread, unheard of. We haven't seen that, in prior elections. And once again, there was about a 30-point spread. We can talk about independents, because they didn't show up at all. And my thought on this is that everybody has a certain intellectual capacity and interest. It's like a pie. And you can only commit so much of your psychic energy to political thought, because you've got other things that you have to do. And the dialogue at the national level is so loud and so overwhelming that it usurps a lot of that capacity. And so as a result, you're not interested in all this other stuff. Governor, yeah, because that's kind of important, that's big on news. But in tracking legislative races and local races, people didn't know who their representatives were. People didn't know who the senators were, And it shouldn't be that way. They had no tolerance for any more political discourse. And the national discourse has really polarized all of us. I mean, you're hard Republican, you're hard Democrat. Nothing much in the middle. That's why the independents didn't show up. So, Louisiana is often said to have a racial voting pattern. What we see here, this big red X, the red line represents the percent of Republican vote, and the blue line represents percent of Democratic vote. One of the things that I have always done is segment people by party and by race. So I have what's called an African American index. Index 1, less than 10% of the African Americans, less than 10% of the registered voters in that precinct would be African American. African American index 10, 90 to 100% would be African American. So what we see is that in the white precincts, we have an incredible vote for the Republican candidate. This is highly consistent. I can show you this on any past race that you want to look at. I can show it to you in local races, I can show it to you congressional, I can show it to you on statewide. Very little on the Democrat down here. As we progress to more African American precincts that have a higher percentage of African American, the Democrat swells and the Republican comes down. And in fact, what we saw, Landry actually got about 10 to 11% of the African American vote, which is really record breaking, on this. I mean, it really is. But the underlying pattern is still the same, on that. But the interesting thing is, this isn't racially motivated, because you look at the treasurer's race. You had a white Republican and a white Democrat. It's exactly the same pattern. Not close, exactly the same pattern. So if the vote was really driven based on whether the candidate's white or black, you would have seen a different turnout when they're both white, on that. So yes, there is a racial aspect of it, but it's just that white people are more likely to vote Republican, and African Americans are more likely to vote Democrat. It's not because they're white or white or black as a candidate. So it's pretty interesting, and that's pretty much what helped. So when we talk about voting patterns being predictable, let me show you a few examples of this. This is lieutenant governor's race. Billy carried 63 of the 64 parishes. Orleans voted with the Democrat. This is the Secretary of State's race. As you can see, once again, much like Landry, we have 4 parishes that voted Democrat, 60 parishes that voted Republican. This is the Attorney General's race. I mean, you see very little change, in these patterns. And this is the treasurer's race, and that's my point. Here, we have the exact same pattern. You have 2 white candidates, in here. So it isn't as though the pattern is voting based on the race of the candidate. It's on the party of the candidate. So let's talk about this. I was involved in Governor Blanco's race in 2003. This is what Louisiana looked like in 2003 relative to electing a governor, okay? So we have blue is obviously Democrat, red is Republican. I did Senator Vitter's race in 2004. And you can see, obviously, Acadiana went Democrat, but the rest of the state pretty much went Republican. Now, when Senator Vitter came in, like it or not, David Vitter, I know he had some issues and things like that. He was a smart guy. He's a real smart guy, and boy, he was focused like a laser. He started what was called the Louisiana Committee for Republican Majority as soon as he got in 2004. So this race, this map right here, represents what Louisiana looked like in 2003 when Kathleen Blanco was elected. And what I did, you've got 9 statewide offices, 7 statewide and 2 U.S. senators. And so every parish, how often did you vote for Republican in 2003? And what you can see that Bossier 4 times, Livingston 4 times, and St. Tammany 4 times out of 9. Republicans had no foothold in the state, none, in 2003. Vitter comes in 2004 and starts immediately with LCORM, Louisiana Committee for Republican Majority, and starts working at the legislative level to build Republican support. By 2007, this is what it looks like. All of a sudden, you see now yellow means that for the 9 possible opportunities to vote Republican or Democrat in the statewide election, yellow means 4 to 6 times you voted Republican this time. That's 2011. Okay? An incredible transition. I mean, you go from a state that looks like this in terms of your non-opportunities to vote Republican or Democrat to a transition in 4 years to a complete transition in 8 years. This is when all of this started. And Louisiana has been dominated by Republican leadership at the state level really since this time. Certainly Governor Edwards was the exception, and I worked on this committee and talked about that. So if we look from 2003 to today, and we look at voter registration, the state has increased voter registration only by about 224,000. Pale in comparison to all of our neighbors in the southeast. Pale in comparison. During this time, we have about 23,000, 24,000 more white voters, 122,000 more African American voters. So while in 2003, white voters represented 67% of all voters, today they represent about 63%. African Americans went from about 29 to about 31. But here's the real biggie. Republicans increased by 363,000 voters in the same period. They went from representing 23% of the voting populace to 34%. Meanwhile, Democrats, 57% of the voters in 2003, dropped to 38% of the voters in 2023. Democrats lost 420,000 voters. People transitioning their registration from Democrat to Republican. So, Louisiana's hardcore Republican. No question about it. This map overlays the 2020 presidential election, how the parish voted, Republican or Democrat, with the current governor's race. And you can see that 54 of our 64 parishes voted for Trump and Governor-elect Landry. Only 4 parishes voted Biden and Democrat Wilson. 6 parishes voted Democrat, voted for Biden, but then voted for Landry, on this. So as I was saying, voting patterns are really highly predictable. I'm going to show you a couple of maps that, hopefully can put this in perspective. The map on the left, this one, is the presidential election by parish. The map on the right is the U.S. Senate by parish. So Kennedy carried 63 parishes. Orleans was the only one that didn't. Trump carried 54. This, to me, is a really interesting map. And I'll tell you a funny story about it, too. On the left is the 2020 by president. On the right is an overlay of the 2012, 2016, and 2020 election. Not one parish changed a voting pattern in those 3 presidential elections. I was doing commentary for WWL TV in 2012, and they wanted me to make a prediction about about the 2012 election race, how it would go with Louisiana. And I said, oh, that's embarrassing. I'm not going to, everybody knows how it's going to go. And they said, no, we need to do that. We need to do that. And so the night before the election, on air, I said, I'm going to go one better. I'll put on the website all 64 parishes, how many votes will be cast, and what percentage will be Republican, what percentage will be Democrat. All 64 parishes. Wow, no problem. So Wednesday, the day after the election, in reviewing it on air, everyone was right. There wasn't more than 2% variation in either number of votes cast or percent for Democrat or percent for Republican. And they said, how'd you do that? I said, those are the results from 2012. I didn't do anything. This is 16. You know that it's going to be exactly the same. And it was exactly the same. And that's what this map shows. We think there's a lot of movement in an election. There typically isn't. That's why it's so important to know who to touch when you're out there campaigning. So Louisiana's propensity to vote Republican, and I apologize, it's hard to see these maps, but this is 20 major races, president, U.S. senator, and governor from 2000 to 23. In 25 of our parishes have voted 18 to 20 times Republican, 90% on those 20 races. Orleans is the only parish that has voted Republican one time, and because there was no opposition, I forget which race it was. But the bottom line is the state is hard right, hard conservative. And it's been an interesting cycle. I was clearly wrong. I really thought that there would be a runoff. And in all of the surveying that I did, both the baseline and the tracking, there was a question that said, if a runoff is required, and the candidates would be Jeff Landry or Sean Wilson, who would you vote for? Landry was always on top, always on top. But it was much closer than what we saw, on Saturday. And that's because African-American voters and independent voters just didn't show up. And so when you do the math on the early voting in terms of the percentages, the voter effectiveness, and you look at the results of the survey, it comes out exactly where it was. It's just math. But it was disappointing that in such an important race that you only had 1 in 3, a little bit better than 1 in 3 voters show up. So anyway, I'd be happy to take any questions or whatever. 1 o'clock? Gotcha. Yeah, so we're done. Sure. No, that's
age, young people.
Oh, let me tell you. I can show you that on this. Bet on the old people. Okay. There is a phenomenal voter efficiency with over 60, 65. And part of that is, because in 2020, during the presidential, which is always the highest turnout, you had the pandemic. And so voting by mail was loosened a little bit. And if you're 65 and you get a mail ballot, you can get it for every race from there on. Mail ballots are typically returned about 70%. So that means like a 70% turnout for that class of people. Young people, I apologize for saying it. I live in Orleans and home of the progressives and everything like that. Don't show up. Simply don't show up. They vote with an efficiency of less than 50%.
How did the deaf people vote?
Excuse me? Well, it depends on how the candidate wants them to vote. That's a vote you can easily influence. Yes, sir.
Redistricting that's coming, how it might affect that?
Well, it really, what's interesting about the redistricting, and I've been very much involved with it, Congressman Carter's district is about 62, 63% African American. So he's got a very safe margin. If you have a turnout similar to what we saw right now, it's going to be a competitive district if it's at 52%. And so you may have 2 African American districts in the 52, 54% range. The safety valve there is that in a presidential cycle, you have very good turnout. And you have turnout by all classes. So that's fine. Midterm elections can be a little different. But if the new districts are in place for the fall of 24, it's a presidential. Yeah.
Have you seen a reduction in political reporting across the state, and has that affected people's knowledge about legislative candidates?
That could well be. I mean, so many people get their news from Facebook and all these other sources, and you don't have a lot of coverage on that. But it was striking to me how many incumbents, legislative incumbents with really big names, surveying their district, people just didn't know who they were. So that could be part of the reason. I mean, local news is so important, but it's less of a source for the general public than it once was.
You showed that map that showed the difference between 2003 and 2012, total shift.
Yeah.
Are there any other states that follow that same trend, like the joining states, or is that something that's sort of unique to Louisiana?
Intuitively, I would say there probably are, but I really couldn't speak to that specifically. I was just involved in this stuff and very much involved in Louisiana politics and speak more intelligently about it, so that's where I stay. Thank you very much.